Second lecture in the series Isolationism versus Internationalism. And today we're going to focus on American foreign policy in the 19th century. But I'd like to take a step back and first of all apologize for the technical difficulties at the end of last lecture. So just to reframe these lectures, we are looking at instances where the United States followed a policy of isolationism. That is, a policy of remaining apart from other countries in the world. Yet at other times in American history, the United States has been globally involved. And so that would be called an internationalist foreign policy. And so we are examining the reasons why we have followed such contradictory policies at different times in American history. But in last week's lecture, I covered a lot of ground, so I think it's a good idea to review the highlights of the first presentation. I began by pointing out that there were certain common themes running throughout American history, and these themes will help us understand the course of American foreign policy. So among these themes is that America, by virtue of its democratic institutions, is an exceptional country. And some would argue not only a unique country, but a superior nation. Another theme that runs throughout American history is that the American people are a chosen people. And as such, America is a nation that is committed to freedom, morality, and the betterment of humankind. Another theme is that the United States has a redemptive mission to serve as a model for all other countries to emulate, a city on a hill. So, do these qualities require the United States to become deeply engaged with other nations, or do they require America to remain apart, distant, detached from the rest of the world? Now, the founding fathers, who certainly disagreed over many issues, they were almost all convinced that the young nation should follow an isolationist foreign policy with respect to other countries. And so individuals such as Thomas Paine, John Adams, George Washington, they all agreed that it was in America's best interest to avoid entangling alliances. Even Jefferson and Hamilton, who differed over just about everything, even they agreed that the United States should not be entangled with other nations, and particularly not with European countries, which seemed to always be engaged in conflict with each other. Washington, our first president, set the tone for isolationism in 1793, when he proclaimed that the United States would remain neutral in France's war with England. And in his farewell address of 1796, he laid out the blueprint for the next 121 years of American foreign policy, when Washington declared, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." And his advice was echoed by our third president, Thomas Jefferson, who endorsed honest friendship with all nations, but entangling alliances with none. But we should keep in mind that isolationism never meant that America should withdraw from the rest of the world. All the early presidents emphasized that America wanted to trade with other countries, and that such commercial interests might be endangered if we formed political alliances with other countries, because those alliances might force the United States into conflict with nations opposed to our allies. And since conflict is bad for business, the United States, it was argued, should not have any political connections with other countries, but we should have commercial relations with those countries. So, as I said, today's lecture will trace American foreign policy in the 19th century with a focus on the degree to which US presidents adhered to the policy of isolationism as recommended by the founding fathers. So let us begin with the administration of Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1809. He was determined to avoid involvement with European nations, other than trading with them. But early on, he found out that pursuing commercial interests sometimes brought the United States into conflict with other countries. Protecting seaborne commerce emerged as one of the earliest foreign policy challenges facing Jefferson. Trading with other countries depended on what was called freedom of the seas. That is, the right for American ships to sail the waters of the world unhampered by ships of other countries. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, rulers of the Barbary Coast, including Tripoli, Algiers, and Tunis, sought to profit from commerce on the Mediterranean Sea by capturing and kidnapping sailors, holding them for ransom, and then collecting large sums of protection money from countries that were willing to pay for it. Very similar to the recent Somali terrorists who would hijack oil tankers and hold them for ransom. Soon after the end of the Revolutionary War, the Barbary pirates captured American ships and actually enslaved the crews. Now, at the time, the United States was too poor to pay the blackmail, and any American ship sailing the Mediterranean was thus endangered. Algiers captured 11 American ships and more than 100 American sailors in 1793 alone. Now, Washington and then John Adams felt it would cost less to pay them than to fight them. And so the United States concluded treaties with Morocco, Algiers, and Tripoli, in which the United States paid $1 million in protection money so that American ships would not be violated. But when Jefferson became president in 1801, he considered such payments extortion, and that those payments would only encourage further outrageous demands by the Barbary pirates. And so Jefferson invoked the doctrine of freedom of the seas, and he sent the Marines to the shores of Tripoli in a war that lasted from 1801 to 1805. That conflict ended with a treaty with Tripoli, but the United States had to pay $60,000 in ransom to free American prisoners that were enchained in Tripoli. But the difficulties with the Barbary states did not end with the end of the Barbary War. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli continued to harass American shipping. And so there was a second Barbary War that ended in 1815. And it was only then that the United States was able to secure free passage of the Mediterranean Sea. So the Barbary Wars asserted America's right to freedom of the seas, at least along the Barbary coast. But France and Britain, which were at war with each other during Jefferson's presidency, those two nations also violated America's right to freedom of the seas. France would intercept American ships trading with Britain, and Britain did the same to American ships headed to France. Here's a cartoon showing England in the form of John Bull taking a bite out of American shipping. In addition, the British Navy was desperately in need of sailors. It was difficult to get men to enlist in the Royal Navy because the pay was so poor, the food was wretched, living quarters were vile, and the discipline was brutal. And so the British decided to intercept American ships and force American sailors into the British Navy. That was a practice known as impressment. That is, American sailors would be impressed into the British Navy. Now, all of that was certainly troubling to Jefferson. And so, because Jefferson wanted to avoid war at all costs, in 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act. And this Embargo Act prohibited American trade with any country. The idea behind that was if we don't trade with any country, then Britain and France will not interfere with American ships, and that will guarantee that we won't get into a war. But the problem is that by not trading with any other country, it almost destroyed the US economy. Farmers, industry, and merchants all depended on trade with other countries. And so the Embargo Act was described as cutting your throat in order to deal with a nosebleed. That is, it was a very extreme step to avoid war, and a step that hurt the United States. But the Embargo Act was also the clearest expression of isolationism. Not only would the United States not ally with other countries, now it would not even trade with them. But because the Embargo Act was so devastating, Congress then reconsidered. After 1809, Jefferson's successor, James Madison, was left to deal with the problem. By 1812, France had stopped interfering with American shipping, but the British continued to violate the doctrine of freedom of the seas. Americans also resented British efforts to support Native Americans who were fighting Americans in the Northwest frontier. And so Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war against England. And the War of 1812 may have had even more to do with the Americans' desire for territorial expansion than with maritime rights. Specifically, many of those who supported the war in the United States hoped that they would gain Canada from the British, as well as taking land from Native Americans in the Northwest. So you can see from this map, there were a number of military forays into Canada, all of which were repelled. And there was fighting in this Northwest territory against Native Americans. A further justification for the War of 1812 was to protect America's so-called racial hierarchy. Britain had been supporting Native Americans in North America, and so the fight against the British was regarded as an effort to defeat Britain's so-called savage allies, Native Americans. In addition, Democratic Republicans portrayed the British impressment of American sailors as a form of white slavery, and therefore war against Britain was seen as a fight for white emancipation. So that's the racial component of the War of 1812. Now, the war ended without a clear victory by either side. The treaty that ended the war restored the status quo ante bellum, meaning that nothing had substantially changed as a result of the conflict. But America was able to assert its right to freedom of the seas against the world's most powerful navy. And also the War of 1812 strengthened isolationist sentiment at home because it convinced Americans more than ever that the United States should refrain from Europe in order to avoid future conflicts. And many Americans emerged from the War of 1812 believing that the United States had succeeded in making a definitive break from Europe. So some Americans even referred to the War of 1812 as America's second war of independence, independence from Europe. From the end of the War of 1812, the war ended in 1814, until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the United States turned its attention to territorial expansion across North America, but not expansion overseas. Americans continued to abide by Washington's warnings against political connections with other countries. But by the early 1820s, many Latin American countries had won independence from Spain and Portugal. So here you see a map of all those countries that had been colonial possessions of Spain and Portugal. And the red dates show the years that they gained their independence. Yet both Britain and the United States were worried that Spain and other European countries might want to intervene to restore colonial regimes in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Britain, like the United States, wanted to see these countries independent because both the United States and Britain wanted to trade with these countries. And if they were independent, then we could trade with them directly. But if they were colonial possessions of Spain, then we would have to first go through Spain as a middleman, and that would make trade with Latin America more costly. And so Britain and the United States supported Latin American independence. Britain then proposed that the United States join with it to issue a joint statement that Britain and the United States would oppose any European attempt to restore the Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But isolationist sentiment was still very strong in America. So President James Monroe rejected the British offer because he didn't want to engage in any political agreement with England. Instead, he unilaterally announced a doctrine which bore his name, the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine said was that the United States would not interfere with the political affairs of Europe, nor would the United States interfere with any existing European colony in the Western Hemisphere, but that the Western Hemisphere was closed to any further interference from Europe. So in other words, after it's 1863, the date on the PowerPoint is wrong. It's 1863. After 1863, the United States would not tolerate any further European interference in the Western Hemisphere. So the main thrust of the Monroe Doctrine was that the United States and Europe should stay out of each other's neighborhoods. And Monroe added a warning that any attempt by a European power to exert its influence in the Western Hemisphere would from then on be seen by the United States as a threat to American security. And so the Monroe Doctrine was yet another plank in the strategy to keep the United States isolated from Europe, as illustrated by this cartoon. But the Monroe Doctrine also had serious implications for countries throughout America. It implied that the United States would be the preeminent country in the Western Hemisphere. So you can see in this cartoon, Uncle Sam's hat is firmly planted in Latin America. And the Monroe Doctrine publicly reaffirmed the aspiration that Europe could keep what is Europe's, but leave the rest of the Western Hemisphere to us. So the implication of the Monroe Doctrine was that the United States would be the dominant country in the Western Hemisphere. Now, in the decade that followed the War of 1812, Americans debated whether to annex territories in the Caribbean and in Latin America. Southerners in the United States were particularly interested in annexing new lands, including and particularly Cuba, because what Southerners wanted to do was to annex Cuba, which had a large African population, and hopefully to get Cuba admitted into the United States, which would give Southerners one more slave state, increasing the political weight of the slaveholding states. But many other Americans were against acquiring territory in Latin America. Some opposed it on racial grounds, that it would bring too many non-whites into America. Some opposed it because much of the region was Catholic, and the United States was a predominantly Protestant country at that time, and because the social hierarchy and racial diversity of Latin American countries made those countries undesirable for inclusion into the United States. Still others opposed annexation on grounds that it would violate Washington's warning against foreign entanglements. It would not be until the end of the 19th century that the United States would seek to assert its dominance over its neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. Instead, up until the end of the 19th century, Americans were determined to proceed westward across the American continent. By the 1840s, America's sense of mission had gained a new meaning, a belief that it was God's will that Americans spread over the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and to control and populate the country as they see fit. In other words, this was a secularized version of the Puritan notion of city on a hill. The idea that Americans were God-chosen people who by providence was charged with the mission of expanding from the Atlantic to the Pacific implied that we would not only expand, but we would bring progress and civilization along the way to less civilized people. And so was born the idea that became known as manifest destiny. The idea that Americans were blessed by God and ordained to expand from the East Coast to the West Coast. The idea of manifest destiny could be seen in paintings such as Daniel Boone, Leading Settlers Through the Cumberland Gap by George Caleb Bingham. This shows Daniel Boone walking along a horse with his wife on top of the horse, and she is a Madonna-type figure. And there are tree limbs there are tree limbs on the ground in the shape of a cross. So this is a religious iconography, which implies that westward expansion was ordained by God. And this religious iconography was revealed in a more contemporary version by George Wright in his painting Westward, the Course of Empire, that reinforces this theme of providence and a sense of mission, the ideology of westward expansion. And that theme is also illustrated in the very famous painting, American Progress by John Gast. Now, this painting hangs in the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. And if we look closely at it, we can really see a visual representation of what manifest destiny represented. In the center of the painting is an angelic figure, which denotes God's approval. And we see, sorry that this keeps happening, we see pioneers heading westward. And as they head westward, we see Indians and animals fleeing from what was represented as the march of civilization. And how do we know that these pioneers are bringing civilization? Well, here is a railroad moving out west. Here are telegraph lines, which the angel is carrying with her, moving out west. So manifest destiny meant that white Americans were ordained to move westward, bringing with them progress and civilization. Now, manifest destiny emphasized the unique qualities of American civilization, the energy and vigor of the American people, their idealism and faith in democratic institutions, and their sense of mission, which was now endowed with a new vitality. Many Americans at that time believed that God blessed the American nation and assigned to the American people the obligation to extend freedom to their less fortunate neighbors. And since they were sure of their cultural and racial superiority, they felt that their destiny was to spread their rule around and to enlighten nations throughout the world. That Americans were the chosen people, chosen because the United States, they felt, had the best society, the best economy, and the best form of government the world had ever known. But this idea of manifest destiny was heavily tinged with racism. It was used to justify the exploitation of Native Americans and Mexicans, two groups seen as less civilized than white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Proponents of manifest destiny insisted that America had an obligation to uplift those so-called backward peoples. It was inconceivable to them that any neighboring population would not want to be part of the United States. But more often than not, manifest destiny was just an excuse to cover selfish territorial motives. Southerners, in particular, promoted manifest destiny because they thirsted after new land, which they hoped would eventually add to the number of slave states, and that would increase their power in Congress. Manifest destiny became very popular in the 1840s, particularly during the administration of President James Knox Polk, a slave-owning Southerner who was an avowed expansionist. The first victims of manifest destiny were Native Americans, as the pioneers moved westward. The next victims were Mexicans. Texas had broken away from Mexico in 1836 and declared it the Lone Star Republic, although many of the people there wanted to be part of the United States. And Southerners wanted to annex Texas, which would then add another slave state to the Union. And so in 1845, in the administration of President Polk, Texas was annexed to the United States. But just as Washington had predicted, foreign entanglements got the United States into war. Mexico resented America's annexation of its former Texas territory. And in 1846, a border skirmish along the southern border of Texas led the United States to declare war on Mexico. And after 2 years of fighting, Mexico was defeated. It was forced to give almost half of its territory to the United States. And that cession of territory was known as the Mexican Cession that you see here on this map. And so it included parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, all of Utah, Nevada, California, and part of Arizona. The Mexican-American War thus fulfilled the aim of manifest destiny, because as a result of the conflict, the United States now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. Then in 1848, President Polk tried to buy Cuba from Spain and to admit Cuba into the Union, which would then add another slave state. But Spain refused to sell Cuba, and Northerners in the United States opposed the purchase of Cuba as well, because they didn't want Cuba to enter the United States as a slave state. And so nothing came of Polk's plan to purchase Cuba. But manifest destiny had some real implications for Central America. The expansion of the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific emphasized the need for a canal across the Central American Isthmus, this area denoted by the arrow here. Early on, the United States recognized the geographical position of Central America as a bridge between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And that made Central America a likely commercial link with the Far East, with South America, and with the Pacific coast of the United States, and that a canal was the most probable means of establishing that link. Also, throughout the 1850s, Central America became the target of private adventurers who wanted to conquer small countries for personal gain or for the extension of slavery in Central America. And so in the climate of manifest destiny, the United States government did little to discourage these supremely opportunistic military adventurers from mounting private expeditions into countries in Central America. Those expeditions were bankrolled by unscrupulous financiers who were seeking profit. And in many cases, those adventures were supported by Southern politicians who wanted to enlarge slave territory. The American minister to Nicaragua, a man by the name of SOLON BORLAND, proclaimed his ambition was to see the state of Nicaragua forming a bright star in the flag of the United States. Borland was a reckless adventurer, but the notorious William Walker put him to shame. William Walker was a daring Tennessean who was known as the gray-eyed man of destiny. Actually, his eyes were a pale green. He was a former physician, a lawyer, a journalist, and a gold rusher who plunged headlong into the politics of Nicaragua. In June of 1855, the 100-pound Walker landed in Nicaragua with a band of American soldiers of fortune, and he quickly established a puppet government under his rule in Nicaragua. He established himself as a dictator, and he ruled Nicaragua from 1855 to 1857. Now, remember, this was not an operation that was planned or approved by the American government. This was an American citizen taking it upon himself to organize a motley band of soldiers to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. As the dictator, he reinstituted slavery there and established English as a second language in Nicaragua. He was an overt racist who dreamed of creating a Central American union based on slavery and run by white men, with himself as leader. But the Central American nations banded together in what they still proudly referred to as the National War to overthrow the Yankee intruder. Walker managed to escape. He returned to New Orleans a hero. But in 1860, he made another attempt to regain power, but he was captured in Honduras. He was tried and executed. While William Walker remained an object of amusement for later generations of Americans, his intervention in Nicaragua left a bitter legacy of North American racism and expansionism. There were two other attempts to annex Cuba in the years leading up to the Civil War. In 1854, Southern congressmen proposed purchasing Cuba from Spain and turning it into a slave state. But that effort, known as the Ostend Manifesto, was thwarted by Northern congressmen who were opposed to that plan. Then President James Buchanan, who preceded Lincoln, also hoped to annex Cuba, but Republicans in Congress prevented him from doing so. Some Americans were also active in Asia. In 1854, Commodore Matthew Perry led an expedition to Japan, but its purpose was to open Japan to American trade rather than American conquest. So these forays into the affairs of other countries between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, they really remained the exception, because for the most part, Americans in the first half of the 19th century were committed to the policy of isolationism. Now, during the Civil War, Lincoln toyed with the idea of colonizing Central America in order to send freed slaves there. The plan would not only ease racial tensions at home, but would also help ensure American control over raw materials and harbors in Central America. But ultimately, Lincoln backed off in the face of protests from African Americans and from abolitionists who opposed the idea, and certainly protests by Central Americans who expressed fears that they would become, quote, Africanized if American blacks were sent to Central America. The end of the Civil War in 1865 resulted in the defeat of the South and its dream of annexing territory in the Caribbean in order to extend slavery. America's appetite for overseas expansion diminished after the Civil War. By then, America was reluctant to acquire any territory populated by so-called alien races. But that didn't mean that expansionist sentiment had been totally extinguished. William H. Seward, Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, had a vision of creating an American empire that would stretch from the North Pole to the South Pole and from California to Asia. He hoped to purchase Iceland and Greenland, as well as the Danish West Indies and the Dominican Republic and Haiti. But Congress was recommitted to isolationism following the Civil War, and so nothing came of Seward's expansionist desires other than the purchase of Alaska from Russia, as well as the annexation of the Midway Islands, both in 1867. But from 1865 through the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the nation was really focused on repairing the damage of the Civil War and putting the nation back together. So from 1865 to 1877, foreign policy took a back seat, and the country was concentrated on economic growth and expanding foreign trade. Discord over the status of newly freed slaves doused any fervor to expand into the Caribbean or Latin America. And so once again, isolationism became the hallmark of American foreign policy. However, Presidents Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant were interested in taking territories in the Caribbean area, such as Santo Domingo, highlighted by this arrow. They also were interested in taking Haiti, as well as the Danish West Indies, which is now known as the US Virgin Islands. And they were also interested in taking Cuba. But Congress was strongly opposed to any overseas adventure. Opponents of this type of territorial expansion warned that extending the nation's reach into the Caribbean might lead to unwanted conflicts with other countries, and that taking territory so far from home would make it difficult to defend against any potential aggressor. And many in Congress agreed with Representative John Farnsworth that the United States should keep its distance from, quote, a motley mixture of French, Spanish, Indian, savages, and Negroes from every part of Western Africa. The reference there was to the multicultural and multiracial populations of countries in the Caribbean. And so that became another argument against taking those countries because they might interfere with the racial superiority of white Anglo-Saxon Americans. Now, America's reluctance to expand beyond North America continued for the next several decades until the Spanish-American War in 1898. Meanwhile, throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, American industrial growth exploded, and overseas commerce continued to expand. In the Pacific, the United States did establish 2 naval stations, one in Samoa at Pago Pago, and the other Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. But the purpose of securing those ports was to support trans-Pacific trade, not to acquire any overseas possessions. President Grover Cleveland took office in 1885, and he made it clear he intended to avoid foreign entanglements. But there were some signs that America might be moving away from isolationism. In 1889, Congress approved of the construction of a fleet of battleships. Now, unlike the lighter ships that the Navy had used to defend the American coast, battleships ran the risk of getting the United States engaged in rivalry with other great powers. And also in 1889, the United States, Germany, and Britain agreed to jointly rule over the South Pacific island of Samoa. That agreement was a clear violation of isolationism because it entangled the United States with Britain and Germany. And those three nations ruled over the peoples of Samoa. But those who supported the agreement argued that the United States needed Samoa so that American ships could refuel on their way to Asia. The treaty binding the United States, Germany, and Britain concerning Samoa was signed under the presidency of Benjamin Harrison, who followed Cleveland. But then, in 1892, Cleveland was reelected, and he tried to abrogate this agreement. But Congress refused to go along, and so the agreement remained. During the Harrison administration, from 1889 to 1893, American owners of sugar plantations in Hawaii arranged to overthrow the government of Queen Liliuokalani. And President Harrison considered annexing the Hawaiian Islands. But when Cleveland was reelected, he withdrew the annexation treaty from the Senate. While President Cleveland wanted to avoid foreign entanglements, he himself was not 100% committed to isolationism. He supported the battleship program, and he was willing to flex American muscles when it came to Latin America. And in 1895, a dispute erupted between Britain and Venezuela over the boundary between Venezuela and British Guyana. The United States regarded Britain's involvement as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and so the United States stepped in to mediate this dispute between Britain and Venezuela. And you can see on this map, this is Venezuela, and this is British-controlled Guyana. And this territory in the shaded area was claimed by both Venezuela and by Britain. Well, when the United States intervened in this border crisis, the Secretary of State, Richard Olney, proclaimed, "Today, the United States is practically the sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." Why? It's not because of the pure friendship or goodwill felt for it. It's not simply by reason of high character as a civilized state, nor because wisdom and justice and equity are the invariable characteristics of the dealings of the United States. It's because, in addition to all other grounds, its infinite resources combined with its isolated position render it master of the situation and practically invulnerable as against all other powers. Well, what did this mean? It meant that the United States was claiming that it was the dominant country in the Western Hemisphere. It indicated that America was ready to embrace a more aggressive approach to other countries in Central America, in the Caribbean, and in South America. And so the Olney Doctrine represents a significant turn away from isolationism and toward a more internationalist foreign policy. Now, once again, from the inception of the nation in 1776 up to 1895, the United States shunned any commitment beyond its own territory. It had numerous opportunities to expand into the Caribbean, into Latin America, but it refused to do so. Up until 1895, there was a national consensus that a policy of isolationism best served the interest of the United States. But that really changed in 1898, when the United States went to war with Spain. Now, ostensibly, the reason why the United States went to war was to defend Cubans who were rising up against Spanish rule. But that war also ended with the United States taking possession of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. So by 1898, the United States not only was no longer isolationist, now it was a colonial nation with an American empire, with overseas possessions. So the question is, what changed in 1898 that moved America from following a policy of isolationism to one of interventionism? Why did the United States abandon isolationism in 1898? The United States fought against British colonialism in 1776, and yet we became a colonial power in 1898. So why were Americans so ready to expand overseas? What forces promoted such a dramatic shift in American foreign policy? Well, I would suggest there were a number of reasons for this. The first had to do with the closing of the frontier. The census of 1890 declared that the United States had been completely settled from coast to coast, that the frontier no longer existed. And with the closing of the frontier, many Americans believed it was time to look overseas for economic opportunities. A second reason for abandoning isolationism had to do with ideology. In the 1890s, a growing number of Americans claimed to believe that with the closing of the frontier, American exceptionalism required the nation to spread its messianic mission to other countries. That America's role as a redeemer nation required it to spread Christianity, democracy, and liberty overseas. So ejecting Spain from Cuba was seen as part of America's messianic role. A third reason had to do with economics. In 1893, the United States was hit with the worst depression in history up to that time. American industries were overproducing, producing too many products for the American population to absorb. And workers were going on strike, demanding higher wages. Now, there were many who believed that if the United States were to acquire overseas colonies, that could solve the economic crisis, because those possessions could create new markets for American goods, and they could become sources of raw material and resources that industry needs. And the people in those colonies could become a source of cheap labor for American factories. And there were diplomatic reasons as well. By the late 19th century, the great powers of Europe were busy carving up empires in Africa and Asia. And some American statesmen concluded that the United States, too, should take colonies in order to compete with European imperialistic countries. And finally, there were military reasons for America to abandon isolationism. A world-class navy was necessary to compete with other great powers. And so it was argued that America needed overseas colonies to serve as coaling stations for American ships, so that these ships could refuel and then sail around the world. So the Spanish-American War represented America's break from isolationism. It was also different than any previous American conflict. The Revolutionary War against Britain was a necessity because independence was at stake. And the War of 1812 was fought to preserve America's vital interest in preserving the right to freedom of the seas. But the Spanish-American War was clearly a war of choice because Spain posed no real threat to the United States. Now, the immediate causes of the Spanish-American War had to do with the sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. And many Americans blamed Spain on the sinking of the American battleship, although later it was proven that Spain had nothing to do with it. Also, there was pressure from American businessmen who wanted America to go to war to Cuba to protect American businesses in Cuba. And the American press was also encouraging the United States to go to war because publishers thought that a war with Spain would sell more newspapers at home. The war ended with an easy American victory. It also, as I said, represented a break with isolationism. By the Treaty of Paris of 1898, which ended the war, the United States paid Spain $20 million in return for the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And also, Spain gave Cuba its independence. Now, this treaty signaled the end of the Spanish Empire in Latin America, but it also marked the beginning of the age of the United States becoming a world power, as indicated by this cartoon showing the waiter, who was President McKinley, serving up a menu that included Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. But we will see next week that there was a public reaction against America's new role as a world power. And that is where we're going to begin next week. So at this point, we will now take a look at the questions or comments that you might have. So if you do have a question or comment, raise your hand and Jerry will unmute your mic so you'll be able to pose those questions. Jerry, your mic is muted, so you